Evening to those of you in Europe, and good morning to those of you awake in Australia. Welcome to the closing plenary session of the ESIG 2021 Fall Technical Workshop. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of ESIG, and I'll provide a few brief opening remarks to this final session. As I think you know, we're a global membership-based nonprofit organization providing objective technical information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of grid transformation and energy systems integration decisions. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working groups, and task forces for our members, and by producing technical resource materials and briefing materials for decision makers. Our workshop sessions are all being held online and are open to everyone. This workshop was planned with the input of our ESIG Offerings Committee, chaired by Bethany Frew of NREL and Julia Matoivasan of ERCOT. The committee consists of the chairs of our 6 working groups and several of our board members. We have a great set of volunteers who really make ESIG what it is, and we encourage you to become involved if you're not already. You can find us on the web at esig.energy, send an email to info@esig.energy to get our monthly newsletter, and follow our activities on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. ESIG also serves a leadership role in the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, often called GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors from around the world to catalyze a rapid, clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and scale. ESIG leads Pillar 1 of the GPST, which deals with the research agenda for the system operators. More information on GPST can be found at globalpst.org. In the workshop sessions this month, you've seen the range of issues that need our attention today. If you participate in our working groups and task forces, you'll be working with world-class domain experts on issues that need our attention tomorrow and will be on the agendas of our future workshops. As I mentioned a minute ago, ESIG is a membership-based organization, and this is why your membership and your participation in ESIG are so important. If you're the member point of contact for your organization, please keep an eye out for the annual dues invoice within the next week. I thank you if your organization is currently a member, and strongly encourage you to consider joining if you are not. Regarding logistics for today, I would ask you to note that the session will be 2 hours long to allow a little more time for presentations and especially for Q&A and discussion at the end. We will have 5 presentations of 15 or 20 minutes each in the first part of the session, followed by 20 or 30 minutes of discussion and Q&A after the last speaker. As we are doing with all of our webinars now, we'll be using the Slido platform for managing the Q&A. You should go to slido.com on your device and enter ESIG28 as the event code to ask your questions. Please be sure to indicate the person to whom you're addressing the question. The instructions are also at the bottom of the background slide for the webinar, and you'll be reminded by the session chair. You'll see a thumbs up button next to the question on Slido to allow you to vote on prioritizing the questions submitted. So please keep the questions coming during the presentations, and we'll address them at the end. We'll follow up with written answers to any questions we don't get to during the Q&A. Recognizing the limitations of a webinar with more than 100 people on the lines will be muted. So again, we ask you to use the Slido platform to ask your questions with ESIG28 as the event code. We would also ask you, if you're comfortable, to identify yourself when you ask a question so we know who we're talking with. Today's session is all about transmission. We've spent a lot of time during the last 12 months taking a closer look at the transmission planning process and changes necessary to build the transmission to move the quantities of renewable energy required to decarbonize the electric system by 2035 and the energy economy by 2050. And it's huge, between 2 to 4 times what we have today by some estimates. Transmission is the glue necessary to hold the system together as we undergo the energy system transformation, and you'll not be disappointed by the great lineup to talk about transmission today. Aaron Bloom of NextEra Energy, a long-standing member of ESIG, will chair our session today. Aaron is a senior director for regulatory affairs and works with a bright bunch of people on the regulatory affairs team, focusing on SPP and MISO. Aaron chairs the ESIG System Planning Working Group, where all of our work on transmission planning, among other things, is getting done. He's been an active participant in ESIG workshops, tutorials, and webinars for many years. He brings a world of experience and a valuable perspective to everything that we do. He's a good friend and colleague, and I'm very happy to have him here with us today chairing the session. Aaron, we appreciate your participation, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Great, Charlie. Well, thank you so much for having me today. And thank you to all the people that are online and calling in. I see a lot of old friends on there. So it's just great to have such a great group from really all over the world. So we have an awesome panel for you today with people bringing perspectives from a variety of dimensions of the power sector. We're going to go ahead and get into the content right away so that we can start learning the new things that people have to tell us. There's some firsts that are going to be in this slide deck today. So stay tuned and listen to everybody. There's a lot happening on transmission today, probably more than at any time in my career. In fact, right now, I know there's several other sessions happening talking about transmission. And if one of your friends just happened to miss it and you hear something great today, I hope that you can go and find that YouTube link to all of our recordings or even other sessions and share it with them and tell that you saw this at ESIG and that you learned something new and can apply it to your work. So as Charlie said, please go to slido.com, enter those questions, enter those remarks. We will take those at the end when we get everybody to turn their camera on and have a discussion. If there's anything else that you need, you can always follow up with me over email, reaching out with Ryan or Charlie or the rest of the gang. And we can't be thankful enough for all of our speakers that take time out of their day to present their new content. We're going to go with the order that you see on the screen. With that, why don't we go ahead and turn it over to Hannes. Hannes joins us from the Brattle group, where he's done a lot of great work for many years on transmission integration. He's not a new face for a lot of people that have been following this space, but he does have some new work to talk about today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him, and let's get this conversation going.
Thank you, Aaron. Good to have you all here. When Aaron told me I got 15 hours to present on transmission benefit cost analysis, I said, great. I only later found out it was only 15 minutes, so I will have to be focused on getting you through these slides. But for more detail, please go through those slides that I will skip at your own leisure. Transmission really is a great enabler, but I think the changing role of transmission also requires that we need to change how transmission is planned. And these discussions are happening right now. As you know, FERC has an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, the ANOPR. They received comments from 170 parties. A lot is happening, a lot is going on, but no doubt it's challenging to make the necessary improvements to build the grid that we will need to have in the next decade or two. Transmission, we are building a lot of transmission. We are investing about $25 billion annually in transmission, not even counting non-jurisdictional entities that are not regulated by FERC, such as BPA, TVA, and WAPA. But I would say more than 90% of those $25 billion a year are solely reactive to reliability needs. Half of it is purely based on local reliability criteria planned by the utilities in the ISOs without going through the regional planning process. And the rest is mostly about regional reliability and generation interconnection, which again is reliability driven. While we do have a lot of experience with transmission benefit cost analyses, very few projects to date are being justified based on economic benefits. The current process will result in higher costs, and those costs will increase as the industry transitions to a clean generation fuel mix. For example, the reliability-driven reactive planning results when it comes to generation interconnection result in costs that are approximately twice or more than twice the costs that you would get from a more holistic planning for a joint planning for all the generation interconnections that we know we will need in the next decade or more. And, PGM has done a recent study showing that when they do plan for generation interconnections, say all 17 gigawatts of offshore wind, those costs of the onshore upgrades are dramatically lower than planning to interconnect one generation interconnection request at a time. The failure to consider economic benefits on transmission projects also results in a selection of projects that are not of the highest value, that do not reduce system-wide costs. It's just not part of the planning criteria. And a failure to consider multiple futures. We know the future is uncertain, so we have to look to different possibilities of where the future might be and plan explicitly with that uncertainty. And failure to do so results in high cost outcome when we will get ourselves caught in futures that we didn't plan for, but we wished we would have had a better transmission infrastructure at that point. And finally, there's a general failure to do interregional planning because reliability is a regional criteria. There's almost by definition no interregional reliability need, but interregional projects really can provide lower cost solution by doing it at scale that work better for the combined regions. So with industry changing, it's just, we have decarbonization, we got decentralization, digitalization. This is all good news. These are technologies that allow us to do new things, but it also requires that we plan transmission in a different way. So what would transmission planning for the 21st century have to look like? The good news is that we actually have a lot of experience, and that experience with proven planning practices that can reduce costs really points to 5 planning practices that we have discussed in much greater detail in a recent report that was filed in the open docket with FERC. The first important piece is that we have to be more proactive in how we plan transmission. If we know that we have to interconnect 17 gigawatts of offshore wind into PJM alone, we should be planning for that right now rather than sitting back and waiting for the individual generation interconnection requests to come in. We have to account for the full range of transmission benefits and multi-value purposes of transmission. Otherwise, we're just not going to build the right transmission, and we're not going to build it at the right scale. And we have to address uncertainties and high stress grid conditions explicitly. And we can do that through scenario-based planning. We know how to do that, but it's rarely done. Finally, from a planning perspective, we have to go beyond looking at it one project at a time. There are big synergies between transmission projects when it comes to integrating a lot of new resources at the scale at which we have to do that these days. And so a portfolio-based planning does make it easier, particularly from a cost allocation perspective, because it's a portfolio of transmission projects will benefit more people, which will make it easier to allocate costs. And it's certainly less contentious to allocate costs if beneficiaries are broader. And finally, we have to start planning jointly between regions to get interregional projects identified that could provide better solutions. Here's just a list of examples where this kind of proactive, comprehensive planning process has already been used and to great success. So we do have that experience. It's just rarely used in transmission planning today. But these proven practices, we can actually go to these dockets and see what has worked and learn from that experience. And the most successful planning stories are based on these type of proactive comprehensive planning, whether it's CRESS in Texas or the multi-value projects in MISO or what CAISO has been doing. It also requires, though, that we understand transmission-related benefits beyond their reliability benefits. Obviously, increased reliability and operational flexibility is something that people understand when it comes to the grid. Reduced congestion, reduced dispatch costs, reduced losses. It goes, if there's a big list of benefits that are rarely analyzed, poorly understood, but the planning processes that have focused on these did find that some of these benefits are surprisingly large and justify transmission investments that look very different from the reliability-based investments that we've been building right now. These benefits are often widespread geographically. If you look at one region at a time, you may not want to build a project if benefits accrue to the neighboring region. And their impacts on market participants is quite diverse, which creates cost allocation challenges, and that's why portfolios can often diffuse these challenges. But the one thing that transmission also does is it lives for a long time. I mean, we are still operating transmission facilities today that were built in the 1920s, and most of our grid that we use today was built in the 60s and 70s, and the purpose for which that grid was built is very different than the purpose for which the grid is used today. And as we do transmission planning, we have to consider that. We can't hope to build a grid and recover all its costs over 20 years when the benefits are much larger and longer lasting. A brief note on adjusted production costs. It's the most widely used traditional benefit metric, but it really results in a rejection of many beneficial projects because adjusted production costs do not capture most of the economic benefits of transmission. There are variations like load LMPs and so on that come out of these simulation models that have the same result. This is from this recent report that I mentioned, and it just shows that adjusted production costs might only account for about 20% of a project's total benefits. Of course, there's some cases where adjusted production costs might capture a larger share of total benefits, but one cannot rely on just adjusted production cost. The metric is very useful, but we have to go beyond it because as it's being applied, it just doesn't include changes in transmission losses. It doesn't consider the additional congestion and curtailments that you experience with transmission outages. It doesn't count savings in capital costs. It doesn't account the fact that rebuilding an aging line at a high voltage level doesn't only have congestion relief benefits, but you also avoid the cost of having to rebuild this line later on anyway. So there's much that needs to be understood about these limitations, and we can definitely go beyond that. And here are 4 examples of RTOs who have gone beyond that, SPP with great success. And I encourage you to look through these citations in the left column there, where SPP has quantified 6 types of transmission-related benefits beyond production cost savings. And that's still only about half of the benefits that SPP has identified, but not quantified. And the same is true for MISO in its MVB analysis. CAISO has done it occasionally for some of its projects, and New York is now doing it for their public policy projects, but not for any other projects. So we have documented a lot of this available experience in several reports. The most recent one is on the right here. And I really encourage you to have a closer look at this because it also documents the specific methodology that people have used to quantify some of these benefits. And it also contains this checklist of benefits that transmission may provide. And our recommendation is to not try to quantify every single one of these benefits for every project, but really consider this checklist for each project, and then identify the benefits that plausibly exist for that transmission investment or a portfolio of investments, and then focus on quantifying that subset of benefits. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to do this for every single one of these types of benefits. And here's some examples of specific applications. This is an old one from 2007 or so, where a proactive scenario-based multi-value planning process has been used by American Transmission Company. Very innovative, very successful. The project was proposed to the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, and the entire hearing lasted 20 minutes, and the commission approved the project with a 5-0 vote. Just shows you that if you do this kind of planning very carefully, it actually makes getting these projects approved much easier as well. But again, production cost savings by themselves, the standard metric would only capture about 40% of the total transmission benefits that were quantified for this specific projects. And interestingly enough, this project was also reducing transmission losses considerably, and the reduced losses paid for about 20% of the project. So it's really surprising to see some of these numbers, and it's surprising to many that things like transmission losses wouldn't be calculated in these metrics already, but the traditional metrics don't do that. And if you look at our report, we actually explain in greater detail why that is happening. More projects, more examples. This one from New York is interesting because the dark blue bar at the bottom shows you that some of these new projects are being built on the right-of-way of old existing projects. And for some of these proposed projects that you see here, the bars, avoiding the cost of having to replace the old project later pays for about half of the cost of a new project. So if you were to replace the old project before you consider this kind of analysis, you really lose the opportunity to upgrade this project, because the right-of-way is more valuable than rebuilding the old line with the same kind of technology would make sense to do. A quick note on uncertainty. What we are finding in our analyses is that transmission has tremendous value of reducing not just the variance of renewable generation across geographic footprints, but also the uncertainty. The system would be much easier to run if we knew today exactly what the wind and solar output would be tomorrow. But the reality is there's a fair amount of day-ahead uncertainty that affects how the system is run, that affects the flexibility needs that we have to have on the system. And having more transmission, having our regions more interconnected really reduces this uncertainty, diversifies this uncertainty, and produces significant savings as a result. Every once in a while, weather events like Winter Storm Uri in February this year reminds us just how costly it can be to not have enough transmission. As Rob Gramlich might note later, if Texas had more transmission, 1,000 megawatt would have been worth $1 billion over just the course of a few days. In around 2000, CalISO did a study during the California power crisis saying that having more import capability would have avoided the entire power crisis, which cost the state tens of billions of dollars. So understanding these kinds of high risk, high impact, low probability events is very important. But it's also important that we look at long-term uncertainties, because if we don't have the grid built when we need it, given that it might take 10 years to build the grid, we might really catch ourselves in a situation where we really wish we would have built that grid but didn't. That gets me to least regrets planning. Least regrets planning sounds great, But the way it is done today, it just looks at a project and says, if that project makes sense in every conceivable future, that is least regrets, and I will only build that. The reality is there's also the regret of not building the project. So when we do least regrets planning, we need to look both at the regret of having built the project and not needing it, but also at the possible regrets, which can be very high, of not having built the project, but really needing it later on. You might find that one project might have benefits that vary greatly across different futures. The project may be beneficial in most, but not all futures. But you might also find that not investing in the project can lead to really high cost outcome in certain futures. And sometimes least regret planning means to build a project as insurance value against these high cost outcomes. I won't go into that level of detail here, but the declining cost of renewables, storage, and advanced transmission technologies has significant implication of how much transmission is cost effective to build. And the planning process needs to consider that. What you might find is that if the cost of storage declines, less transmission is optimal. You might still need a lot of new transmission, but the mix of resources and transmission depends on the relative costs of this. That's why advanced transmission technologies that can reduce the cost of transmission might make it more optimal to build more transmission. But as this chart shows on the right here, as the share of renewable generation increases, the optimal level of transmission increases with it. And advanced grid technologies can easily increase the capability of the existing grid, but they also increase the capability of new investments, which makes the benefit cost ratios of new investments more favorable, which makes it easier to build new transmission. And it makes it cost effective because it reduces the overall cost. Even if you spend more on transmission, total costs will be less. So in summary, we have to consider the broad range of benefits, not just reliability, but also economic and public policy benefits. We have a lot of experience with that already, and we should use it. We do need to reduce the divisiveness of cost allocation, but we can do that with broader portfolio-based planning. And we have to look at infrastructure beyond near-term reliability needs if we want a lower cost system in the long run. So let me stop here and give it back to Aaron. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much. And I already saw some comments in the Slido asking for links. I think we just got all the answers on where to go look for it. If you have any problems finding it, do reach out and let us know. I'd like to turn the conversation over now to Rick Vail, who's a first-time ESIG participant coming to us from Pacificorp. So Rick, thank you so much for joining us, and really looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us about transmission in your territory.
All right, thank you, Aaron. Good afternoon. Go ahead and go to the next slide here. You might hear me echo a few of the themes that Hannes just covered in regards to identifying transmission benefits. I'm going to try to utilize a somewhat specific example from Pacificorp. Back in 2007, Pacificorp introduced its Energy Gateway Transmission Expansion Project. So you can kind of see the map here. One of the primary focal points of the Energy Gateway project was to try to take, high capacity factor wind from Wyoming and deliver that to the load centers of Pacificorp's, service territory. So along the Wasatch Front in Utah, but then also all the way over to the Northwest. And this is a multi-year transmission expansion project, roughly 2,000 miles of new transmission. One of the things that was mentioned as well is kind of the regional nature of transmission and being able to have that kind of broad, diverse geographic set of resources. And if you kind of look at the footprint here, you know, there's a lot of hydropower in the Northwest, there's a lot of solar down south, and you have the high capacity wind in eastern Wyoming. And the idea is to help, you know, try to connect and bring all this together. So far, we've got 4 major segments of Gateway are complete. The next segment that is up is Gateway South. That basically goes from eastern Wyoming down into central Utah, and we plan to build and construct that segment by the end of 2024. Now, one of the big challenges with the Energy Gateway Transmission Project has been the benefit calculation. And again, I'd probably echo just a number of the things that Hannes just shared. When I came into transmission, we came up with what we call the system benefit tool, and we identified these 7 benefit categories that we were trying to attach some customer or economic benefit to. You can see that this list is greatly simplified compared to what Hannes had up there. And part of that was at the time when we rolled the system benefit tool out, it was really trying to come up with what are those benefit categories that you know, would demonstrate you know, being a customer benefit. And so kind of have a star here. Back in the 2015, 2017 timeframe, we were able to identify different operational cost savings. You know, we performed a pretty big loss savings study to demonstrate for each of the different segments what those loss savings would be. Tried to utilize different transmission reliability benefits, where when you have different parts out of the system out with or without the new transmission, you know, could you identify the impacts, you know, to generation curtailment. One of the really interesting ones that we got actually a lot of stakeholder pushback on was customer reliability and some of the regulatory benefits. And what we were trying to do there was really capture, you know, some of the avoided outages with these new transmission segments. And at the time, you know, transmission wasn't near as popular of a topic as it is today. And we certainly got a lot of different input and I'll say pushback on those. Hannes also mentioned the avoided capital cost, and that was another item that we tried to capture that we got quite a bit of pushback on. So again, this was what I'll kind of call Pacificorp's, you know, initial simplified model of looking at some of those transmission benefit calculations, and we've been working pretty hard over the years to continue to improve what we can do in identifying the benefits of transmission. So one of the bigger enhancements came in 2019. So the transmission group works very closely with our integrated resource planning group. And what we were really trying to do in our IRP modeling was come up with a way to precisely represent, you know, transmission costs and then the associated opportunities that come, you know, with new transmission. So that obviously includes any additional resources along with the transmission itself. And at the time, prior to 2019, in our IRP modeling, we really had no way within the model itself to have the model select the transmission along with the resources. And so the IRP team and transmission teams work together pretty well in order to come up with a way for that model to endogenously select transmission along with the resources in that IRP topology. And prior to that, what we really had to do was out-of-model cost reconciliation. So being able to have the model choose that and then demonstrate that the choice of that transmission along with those resources really was the least cost, least risk portfolio coming out there. That was actually a pretty big step forward for Pacificorp. I should mention too that, you know, with Pacificorp, we've got 6 different states. Each one of our states might have a little bit different requirements when it comes to our IRP process. And then, you know, FERC, of course, is kind of oversees the transmission side. So there is a lot of regulatory process and a lot of regulatory scrutiny when it comes to transmission investments, because our states do have different IRP requirements. They also have siting authority for the transmission, and they may or may not look at transmission benefits in a different light. One thing I will note, though, that our state regulators definitely want to have a better understanding of what those transmission benefits are, if there are any cost savings, and you know, they really want to understand what the benefits of transmission are, you know, to the customers in their state. So some additional modeling enhancements that have happened in our IRP modeling. We went to a new software package. So we're now using the Plexus model, which it basically has an endogenous selection for incremental transmission construction built into that. So what that really allowed Pacificorp to do was, you know, increase the processing time of each of the different scenarios and portfolios that we run through the IRP process. And in particular, being able to select each of the different energy gateway segments or a number of those segments along with the resource selection. And we were able to, in the model itself, account for the avoided capital costs of other projects. And that's really important from a Pacificorp standpoint, because, you know, again, each of these states takes the IRP preferred portfolio. They're very interested in having both the transmission and resource selections and understanding that they are least cost, least risk. So as much of the transmission benefits that we can capture within the Plexus model as possible and have that come out through our IRP portfolio was very important. And then the last note I have on here is, you know, Pacificorp has reached outside of the company to conduct additional consulting studies and identify additional transmission benefits, not only within its footprint. And if you kind of look at the energy gateway projects, the majority of that falls within Pacificorp's 2 different balancing authority areas. It certainly touches areas outside of Pacificorp service territory, but when you kind of, and I'll go back to this map just really quick to kind of put it in perspective. With Energy Gateway, this is just one piece of the puzzle out west. And I think it's just a small piece of the puzzle. In order to truly integrate all of the renewables that are going to be needed to, you know, reliably serve the Western Interconnect, it's going to take a lot more than just this Energy Gateway footprint. And so Pacificorp has really tried to step back and look at it in that broader regional view and try to determine, you know, what additional transmission is required out there, looking at that longer term future and trying to understand what the renewable needs are, where the loads are going to be. I think, as Hannes pointed out, is really a critical step, and it's really that critical next step that needs to happen very soon. It took, just for this 2,000 miles of transmission, it took Pacificorp roughly 13 years before we got final records of decisions on all of these segments. So I would just note, obviously, planning, capturing those transmission benefits early on in the process, and starting sooner rather than later to, you know, build out the future of you know, green energy in the West, and kind of decarbonizing the West is really key. I think that's it. I'll turn it back to you, Aaron.
Oh, Rick, that was great. I was really excited to hear about all the expansion that you're doing and how you're doing the coordinated generation and transmission expansion to find the best solution that looks at all the benefits. So thank you so much for your discussion. I see questions still coming in on Slido. Please go into Slido, ESIG 28, and add your questions there so that we can have a discussion at the end. Next, we've got a visitor from Germany, Albert Moser. Glad to have you here today, and really excited to hear about the way that Europeans are taking a look at calculating transmission benefits.
Yes, Aaron, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And also thank you very much for being invited to this interesting conference. I will talk about the European way on calculation of transmission benefits. It's more a state-of-the-art report rather than a list of a recommendation. I think it's definitely of interest for you what's going on in Europe. Since I'm not really sure how you all are familiar with the European market for electricity, I have a short introduction in our European market, or the market of the European Union for electricity, and into the setup of this market, so you better understand how transmission planning takes place in Europe. The main thing to understand is that we have a two-level transmission planning process. The first one is a European level, which is under the regulation of the European Union, which focus, let's say, of cross-border capacity or interregional capacity. And the second level, or the second layer, is transmission system planning within the member states. And I will go into detail on those levels. So first look at the European level, and second also look at what we do in Germany. Okay, it's like this. Right? So just a rough overview about the European market for electricity. Some key figures, as you can see on the right-hand side, most of the states in Europe are included in the European market. Unfortunately, as you know, United Kingdom is not anymore a member of the European Union and is also out of the internal market for electricity of the European Union. But if you see our generation mix in all over Europe, of course, it's varying from member state to member state. So we have about 2,800 terawatt hours per year on generation, and demand about 1,000 still is fossil based, and of course it will be reduced in the upcoming years. We have about almost 700 terawatt hours which is still nuclear based, mainly in France. Some nuclear power stations also outside of France, still in Germany. We have some about 1,000 terawatt hour is already renewables, and we also have some small imports from other countries in Europe, but outside the European Union. On the next slide, I want to go a little bit into detail on the, let's say, regulatory framework we have in the European Union. We distinguish between so-called regulations, which are effective right away. So once decided by the European Commission and the European Parliament, they are effective in all member states. And we have so-called directives, which are, let's say, more a framework, and the member states have the task to put the rules of the directive into national laws. The European regulation on the internal market for electricity more or less focus on the cross-border issues. Yeah? So it describes our zonal market model, the electricity trading, the capacity allocation, congestion management, also the bidding zone review. I will come to it later as one part of the transmission benefit consideration. Also questions of resource adequacy and the transmission. Within the transmission system operation, we have also the so-called 10-year network development plan, you see the figure 1. This is the first topic I want to talk about later. This is actually a pan-European, let's say, cross-border network development plan. We have also some rules of distribution system and network codes. In addition, we have a regulation on guidelines for trans-European energy infrastructure. These are regulations for energy infrastructure priority corridors and areas, and they provide so-called project of a common interest. These are cross-border transmission projects, which are, of course, of common interest, as the name says, but once you have a status of such a project, you get some special, let's say, regulatory and financial support to implement these projects. But these projects of common interest are somehow linked to the 10-year network development plan. So I'll explain this part also within the 10-year network development plan. And finally, we have the directive where we have the rules for the national network development plans. And in the third part, I will also give an example on the German case. On the next slide, I start into describing what happens in the so-called 10-year network development plan. It was already mentioned to cope in one of the speeches before, to cope with the uncertainty. In Europe, it's common to deal with different scenarios. And within the European Union, we have actually 3 scenarios. The first one is the national trend scenario, which is in line with the national climate plan. So it's a bottom-up scenario, and it provides a forecast up to the year 2040, or a future up to the year 2040. And we have 2 different other scenarios which are in line with the COP21, so with the 1.5 degree goal. And the one is called distributed energy is a top-down scenario with decentralized innovation, and it looks forward up to the year 2050, and also a global ambition scenario, which is more centralized innovation based, but also a top-down approach. And then the second step, and now the transmission benefit comes into place for the very first time, we have a so-called system needs study. The system needs study shows borders or areas or cross-border areas where new solutions for electricity exchange is needed. Yeah. These system needs actually calculate transmission capacities, but just to express the needs, not to express the solution. Yeah, so it could also be done with other technologies than, for example, an overhead transmission line. It's focus on the cross-border capacities, since the national lines are part of the national grid development process and it's based on the national trend scenario for the year 2030 and 2040. And the only criteria here is the socio-economic welfare. And after the system needs study, the people, or not the people, the transmission companies or other shareholders can propose projects to reinforce the grid that address actually the system needs. And all these projects are assessed by a so-called pan-European cost-benefit methodology, which I will explain later on, where you see the different criteria within this multi-criteria assessment we use. It's basically a so-called pinned and toot methodology. So put in one at a time and take out one in a time. So among the lists of options, when you compare them, you put in one and do the assessment, and put all into the assessment and take out one. So actually, it's 2 different approaches to assess different measures to increase transmission capacity. At the end, it's a non-binding, community-wide, so EU-wide 10-year network development plan. And this 10-year network development plan is also the sole basis for the selection of the projects of common interests, which are somehow supported by the European Union. Here, just a rough overview about the scenarios the European Union use, or the European transmission system operator use, and you see the different parameters for the different years, 2025, 2030, 2040, for the three scenarios: distributed energy, global ambition, and national trends. I do not want to go into detail here now, but as you can see on the right-hand side, where we look at the annual demand, especially the distributed energy scenario foresees, let's say, about 1,000 terawatt-hour more of demand in the future, in the year 2050. So how does this network development plan, the identification of the system needs, work? So the methodology is described here. It actually consists of two major steps. The first one is the so-called preparatory step, or preparation phase, where the interzonal impedances, capacitances, and loop flows are determined and bundled as constraints for the zonal model we have in Europe. And then the second one is the implementation phase, where necessary grid enforcements are identified and quantified in their impact on the change in social economic welfare, CO2 emissions, and RES penetration. As I already said, the outcome of the system needs study is a list of target capacities that provide the most economically efficient means of reducing cross-border congestion and total system costs. And it starts with a so-called reference grid, which usually is composed of the existing grid and all the projects that are likely to be implemented by the date of the scenario that is considered in the study. For 2030, a so-called NTC, net transfer capacity model for the cross-border modeling is used, and for the 2040, the grid is reduced to a reasonable and workable number of zones, about 100 for Europe. And starting from the reference grid, the expansion model optimizes the total system costs based on optimal interconnection capacity increases. So from a panel of possible network increases, the model chooses the best combination that minimizes the total system costs, composed of total network investments and generation costs. And with the resulting 2040 optimized grid, the benefits provided to the electric system by these investments can be computed, which is first, of course, the decrease in generation cost, second, CO2 emission reduction, and third, the reduction in curtailed energy due to additional possible exchange. As an example, here I show the result of such a system needs study. So at each cross-border capacity, you see the green and blue and magenta figures that show the target needs. But very interesting is also that the optimum is quite flat, so that with this red figures that show additional capacity increases that, when they are added, lead to the same overall socio-economic welfare. This is an example of the system needs study where we take this benefit, but just the socio-economic welfare into consideration. But on the next steps, we have the so-called 10-year network development plan, where we do a cost-benefit analysis for all the projects that are proposed to meet these system needs. And there's actually also a clear methodology described by the European transmission system operators. And the key benefits which are being addressed in this cost-benefit analysis are, of course, reduction of overgeneration, so cost by dispatch and redispatch, monetize CO2 emissions resulting from the new exchange and the evolution of losses, the change in the curtailed energy volume induced by the project, the evolution of emission of several polluting gas induced by the generation mix, the evolution of the volume and the cost of the electric losses on the grid. And number 6 is support to adequacy by reducing the loss of load expectancy and decreasing the need of generation capacity. There are also some others transmission benefits that are evaluated during this cost-benefit analysis, but these 6 are the most important one. And indeed, for all the projects in such a 10-year network development plan, we have such a project sheet. We'll take an example. For example, this cross-border interconnector, I think it's an HVDC line from France to UK. This is, for example, the example Nautilus, so an interconnector Belgium, UK. In such a project report, all the calculations, the results of the calculations are compiled. So the increase in the socio-economic welfare, for example, you see it for the 2030 figures and the 2040 figures. You see it for different scenarios, min and max. Also the reduction of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, the integration of renewable energy sources, and then all the other transmission benefits are calculated and compiled in a sheet per project. I have also, or I want to discuss also another topic which is not really fully a transmission development. It's more, let's say, the use of the transmission capacity we have in Europe. I already told to you that we have a so-called zonal model. This means our system, or at least for the market operation, the system is separated into so-called bidding zones, and within the bidding zones, the traders, the trading can take place without consideration of any congestion. But when you want to trade across the zones, you need to reserve a capacity and have a special capacity allocation methodology in place in line with trading. And this takes place in the day ahead trading, which you see on the left-hand side. These are all the members of this market coupling in the day ahead market, where we have an implicit auction of these cross zone capacities. And we have it also in the intraday trading, which you see on the right-hand side. I think Italy has already joined this single intraday trading market coupling. And the current delimitations of the bidding zones are provided here on the left-hand side. And we have a so-called bidding zone review process, I think every other year. So where the TSOs have to look if other setup of bidding zones would increase the benefit to the system. And currently we have 2 capacity allocation methodologies in place. The first one is the traditional one, the NTC based, the net transfer capacity based, and the other one is a flow based capacity allocation, which better, of course, models the transmission capacities available. To see on the right hand side, you see the green countries here. These are all the countries that are already applying the flow based methodology. And this bidding zone review, which takes place, as I said, I think every other year, also looks at a set of benefits to market efficiency, network security, stability and robustness of bidding zones, and of course at the energy transitions. So a lot of things like economic efficiency, firmness cost, which means the cost to have the capacities, the cross-border capacities or interzonal capacity firm. Looked at market liquidity, market concentration and market power, competition, effective competition, price signals for building infrastructure, accuracy and robustness of price signals, also transition and transactions cost. Of course, if you change such a bidding zone arrangement, there you have transition and transactions cost, infrastructure costs, and some others. Yeah, also on the network side, so network security, operational side, security of supply, also the degree of uncertainty in cross-zonal capacity calculation, and of course the stability of robustness of bidding zones. Of course, there is, let's say, one of the criteria that we do not change the bidding zones every other year. So we expect at least some years of use of a certain arrangement of bidding zones. At the end, if the time allows, I want to go and tell a little bit about the German grid development plan. Yeah? So the European Union is in charge of the cross-border capacities, but the individual member states are in charge of the national grid development plans, and the German one is somehow similar to the European process. At the beginning, we have scenarios. Yeah, the scenarios are prepared by the transmission system operators in Germany, and then we have a consultation process. Then the German TSOs compile the first draft of the network development plan, and this is checked and approved by the Federal Network Agency, which is our national regulator. What I want to tell here is that only for the cross-border interconnectors, we use a similar approach like the cost-benefit analysis in the 10-year network development plan. It's done by the TSOs during the grid planning, and also the German regulator does such a cost-benefit analysis. But when it comes to internal lines, there is no calculation of transmission benefits so far in Germany. It's just application of the N-1 criteria and the so-called, what we call NOVA principle, which means German TSOs have to make sure that first measures that optimize the network are used before measures that reinforce the network, before actual new network expansion takes place. There's one exemption. We had so far so-called ad hoc measures, fast-track measures, phase-shifting transformers, so-called load flow control devices, which were also part of the network development plan. And but this was not a 10 or 15-year forecast like the lines. It was just a 5-year forecast in order to reduce the redispatch cost. And here, savings in the redispatch for the upcoming 3 to 5 years were evaluated and had, of course, to exceed the investment costs for the phase shifting transformer. I think we have about, that's my last picture, I think we have about 10 phase shifting transformers in the process of being built in order to cope with our congestion. On the left-hand side, you see our DC lines. Yeah, we plan 4 DC lines and 4 others, additional one for the upcoming years and for to the year 2030. It's interesting to know that except one, all of them will be built with underground cable, so plus minus 525 kV underground cable. So thank you very much, and I want to hand over now the floor to Aaron again.
Albert, thank you so much. It was great to hear the European perspective and understand some of the similarities between some of the metrics that we're looking to measure and the metrics that you're already looking at. So I think that there's a lot to learn here. So please, we're seeing a lot of action on Slido. Go add your questions up there as we get Rob Gramlich, who's been a longtime contributor here at ESIG, all queued up to talk. Again, we're going to have a conversation at the end, so please stick around and please add your questions. Rob from Grid Strategies is here to talk to us about transmission policy for the power system of the future. And Rob, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thanks, Aaron. Can you hear me all right?
You sound great.
Great. Well, it's great to be on with everybody. Wish we could be in person, but someday soon. This couldn't be a more timely conversation. We've got a lot happening here where I am in Washington, D.C. on transmission policy. It's definitely the biggest year for transmission policy ever in the country. That includes the 2005 Act. We have so much going on at FERC and in Congress, and we'll talk about all that. But let me start just a little bit of the context. I showed a couple of these slides back in, I think, in June at an ESIG meeting, but just want to review them a little bit to set what I think, what I consider to be the context underlying federal transmission policy. So there we go. Whoops. Get that bigger, get to the next slide. And there we go. So first of all, a lot of conversations about resilience and reliability. And I think widespread awareness now that didn't used to exist about the importance of interregional transmission to keep the lights on. This story is now, I think, familiar to a lot of people, but there was strong interregional transmission capacity during Winter Storm Uri in February. That was used to flow power from east to west. A lot of these flows are prevailing west to east, and a lot of the transmission lines used were largely built. Some of these were MISO MVP lines built largely for west to east flow for northern Great Plains wind power to get to Chicago and points east, but those same lines were used to send power from PJM over to MISO, and then MISO through to SPP, keeping the lights on there. And of course, ERCOT in Texas didn't have that opportunity. Their capacity was much more limited. So as Hannes indicated earlier, if you consider the value of that interregional transmission, just in some of these rare but super important time periods, it was extreme. My colleague at Grid Strategies, Michael Goggin, calculated that a 1,000 megawatt line into Texas, additional gigawatt of capacity would have essentially paid for itself in 2.5 days, and 15 or 20% of a line would have been paid for in terms of additional capacity into MISO. So I think a lot of people are thinking about RWTH. So how do you value that prospectively when we're thinking of transmission planning? Thinking about it a little bit more like insurance, as Hannes indicated, might be a little bit better framework rather than just production cost savings. And I think it's all part of this evolution out of our multi-decade history of thinking about dispatching systems with different variable costs and trying to find optimums that way into a different type of framework where you have a whole lot more low to zero marginal cost units, but you have these situations where you got to ship a lot of power. So how do you value that? And then what I consider to be the main barrier to transmission is cost allocation. Who pays how much? And so if you think about, again, going back to these lines in the upper Midwest, well, who benefited from them? Back when they were planned for 10 or 15 years ago, it was assumed, again, west to east flow. Well, what about these rare instances? But that they are certainly imaginable and modelable in terms of scenario planning. So maybe we should make sure we account for the benefits on both sides and how load benefits from transmission that can be very useful in these scenarios. So that's one aspect of what I consider to be sort of a new federal policy thinking around transmission policy. And then the other is probably more obvious to this group, which is climate and clean energy. Some of these maps and graphs are familiar here. Aaron led the creation of a couple of them. And I see the author of another one on the line here. The idea, as everybody here is well aware, is you got to ship not only power from remote areas to load, but back and forth, given the diversity of the resource, the wind in different wind regimes, solar in different time zones, or a cloudy place and a sunny place, and just variability from within the solar fleet and within the wind fleet, and then across different renewable technologies. All these factors lead to power moving back and forth across wide areas. And these large-scale studies of decarbonization show sometimes 2 to 3-fold increase in national transmission capacity. That one on the right is power over 30 gigawatts in some scenarios, moving back and forth across the eastern and western interconnection on just a diurnal basis, day-to-day power flowing back and forth. The bottom left is the SEAM study amended by Jim McCallie to add a little offshore northeast. We're going to hear from Theodore next. So we're updating kind of the new reality with all the offshore wind opportunity and the opportunity for transmission linking the northeast grids. And the top left is the MIT. But you know, all these studies, and there's the Princeton Net Zero, and there's others out there that are kind of showing the same dynamic. So again, not unfamiliar. And then a little bit more in the details, just one thing I try to emphasize here in Washington and with policymakers is there are massive economies of scale in transmission. The dollars per delivered megawatt are much lower at higher voltages. And, you know, this applies to AC and DC and different technologies and configurations. But the idea is, as Hannah said earlier, you know, we're kind of nickel and diming transmission, doing it incrementally and low voltage based on just reactive approaches to what's in the generator interconnection queue, and it'd be a lot cheaper if we turn the headlights on, planned a little forward, and then we could capture these economies of scale. And then one more sort of bit of context is if your lens to the electric industry is through the, you know, looking through from a generator perspective, trying to get interconnected, you're seeing essentially we've reached a point where we've saturated capacity in just about every region. And so what happens, and this is a MISO graph of the more recent parts of the interconnection queues, the cost per kilowatt start going up and up and up, sometimes approaching the cost of the generation itself in terms of dollars a kilowatt, whereas the lower green bars are sort of in the past. It was lower, partly capturing the benefits of previous transmission like the MISO MVP. But, you know, once all that transmission gets used up, the costs start going up, especially, again, if we're only planning on a kind of a project by project basis. We're not integrating it and doing all those other planning methodologies that Hannes described. This is another chart from the report that Hannes showed. He showed some of the positive examples. So I guess we're playing a little good cop, bad cop here. He showed how we can do this. All of these RTOs have done all of these practices. This is a report that we did together, my company, Grid Strategies, along with Jake Hatsberry, Michael Goggin, and his Hannes and his team. So I'll play a little bit more of the bad cop. And here we want to distinguish between what people are able to do from what is actually happening. So there's a difference between analysis and actual plans. So this graph, this chart is based on what was most recently approved by each of these RTOs or these planning areas. We have 12 planning authorities in the country. And if you just look at the last board approved plan, you know, even though sure, many of them are doing scenario planning, they might be considering multi-value, but that's not what gets into the plan. What gets into the plan is simply the reactive incremental transmission needed to comply with NERC like next year, rather than doing the forward-looking planning that everybody's been talking about on this panel. So, you know, those grades are not great, and we've got a ways to go to fix it. And I'll talk in a second here about how we hope to fix it. I think it's always important to talk when we're talking about big transmission, which is the main focus of this panel. We should certainly make sure that customers are assured, and the people paying these expensive for these expensive assets, that we're getting the most out of the existing grid. So the new term of art is grid enhancing technologies from FERC, and the technologies we usually refer to are here: topology optimization, dynamic line ratings, power flow control. Some people put storage as transmission in there. And generally, these are very low cost. They're deployable in months. They're scalable modular, sometimes redeployable. So they're very flexible, and they provide a lot of options. There's sometimes, if you know you need a major transmission line, these are not often a replacement, but they can optimize the existing grid before you need to do that. They are often very useful with, in fact, during transmission construction when you have to take lines out of service, and for a variety of other purposes. So FERC has a proceeding on these specifically, and an incentive to encourage them called shared savings. I think similar to what you heard about from Albert in Germany. So it's a sort of, if the production cost savings exceed the cost by enough, then they are deployed and the utility gets an incentive for it. So turning to what do we do about it? First of all, it's always helpful to look at models of success. One can get kind of defeatist in transmission because it's so hard. But look, we can do it. We have done it. We've done large interstate cross-region transmission in this country in recent years. So if we have done it, it shouldn't be that hard to do it again. So these projects here all had roughly 2.5 to 3 to 1 benefit cost ratios. I've mentioned MISO MVP, SPP priority projects, ERCOT CREZ, California ISO had a couple. And the winning formula that works is proactive multi-benefit planning with broad beneficiary pays cost allocation. The law of the land, it still is that beneficiaries need to pay. But that doesn't mean you have to go on a narrow basis like Hannes described. You can consider all the benefits and make sure people on both sides across these large links pay their share. So now, what are we doing about it? Let me talk a couple slides on FERC and a slide or two on Congress, and then I'll turn it back to Aaron and Theodore for the cleanup here. But big stuff at FERC. This is what I've been personally hoping for quite a long time, is a major FERC transmission planning reform rule. It's been 10 years since the last one called Order 1000. And all we have now is a set of questions in the form of an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, a NOPR. But certain commissioners are pretty clear about where they're going. Other commissioners are more asking questions and trying to, decide for themselves whether they want to support this. But the general thrust of what's in there looks to be a nationwide rule requiring certain planning methods. We'll talk about that in a second. And cost allocation to reflect all the beneficiaries. So essentially that winning formula from the previous slide looks to be on the table at FERC, as well as potentially some fixes in process to interconnection. So what are these planning reforms? Here is the list that I see in the FERC statements and in the record as the most likely. Again, this paper that Hannes and I and our colleagues did lays out these planning methods. As far as I read the record, it looks like there's quite a bit of support for these things. And so it seems to be more of a question of how do we do it rather than whether we do it. But I could easily imagine FERC requiring each region to essentially prove that it is doing these things. So what are these things? Number one, plan for anticipated future generation as well as load. Everybody knows you're supposed to do a load forecast, and that's in every transmission plan. But it seems to have been ignored to do a generation forecast. And everybody knows the resource mix is changing, and it's in the state laws and the integrated resource plans and many other public sources. So put that into the plan. Don't just consider it, put it into the plan. There's some questions about how to do this. Do the load serving entities have to sort of declare what their resource mix is? Who decides? There are a lot of questions there, but again, that's a how, not a whether to do it question. Number two, multi-benefit de-siloed planning. Hannes went through these before, so I'm just restating. Don't do congestion, resilience, public policy, reliability, et cetera, all separately. Put them all together. Usually the math works, as he showed in his slides. If you put them together, they cross the threshold and are net beneficial. Number three, portfolio plan. It's more efficient to plan an integrated network than it is to do it line by line. there are so many economies of scope and economies you get from configuring a network right, that those economies should be captured by the plan, and then those savings should be passed through to customers. Number 4, scenario-based, concerning severe weather and resilience, so that we can pursue the least regrets option. Number 5, joint interregional. Interesting idea from PJM and LS Power and a few other commenters. Maybe there should be a standard, a national standard on interregional transmission capacity. We might talk about that in the discussion here. I think NSOE does that in Europe, but that might be useful to have here, because from a reliability perspective, you know, you can say generation will all be fine and available, but you know, time after time, stuff happens to generation, and interregional transmission tends to be there to save the day. So maybe there should be a minimum level. And finally, more and better use of benefit cost analysis. Let's put all the benefits together, compare them to all the costs, and do it that way. That's similar to what I think Albert's description in Europe of the SEW, the social economic welfare. I mean, it's music to my ears, having studied economics and public policy. It's just, that's just obviously the way to do it. That's what every benefit cost textbook and every public policy guide says to do, and yet we don't do it. We don't get any more close to it in transmission planning in the country. Yet FERC's responsibility is to ensure just and reasonable rates. You would think they would want to do that. Okay. So that's FERC. Quite a lot happening at FERC. That could be the biggest rule out of that agency ever. Meanwhile, a lot of us are busy here in Washington on some things on a few blocks away from FERC in Congress. In the 117th Congress, we've got all of these things are currently in the 2 bills, one or the other of the bipartisan bill or the what's called the Build Back Better bill. These things, along with generation tax credits for wind, solar, and storage, these transmission specific provisions are so far still in there, knock on wood. The high level agreement seems to be there between the key players on these bills. They're really trying to get it done this month. In fact, this week. And we'll see how far they get. It won't be signed into law, but they could get agreement on all the specific provisions. And it's pretty impressive that the climate provisions held stronger than any other area of the entire package. So the Build Back Better bill has at this point $555 billion for climate-related provisions. So people are saying that it was the Democrats' top priority, climate was, to preserve in this bill. It got cut the least as they had to sort of negotiate down to get agreement. And then within the climate, there are these transmission-specific provisions, and they include, number 1, a 30% investment tax credit for regionally significant transmission, loans and grant funding for large-scale transmission, $8 billion. So remember back to my first slides about the assumptions in Washington. I think there is recognition that these large-scale movements of power are needed. So these 2 pots of money here, the first one probably costs the government about $10 billion, the second one $8 billion. So we got $18 billion between those 2. And take the third one, the $2.5 billion anchor tenant loans, talking about $20 billion, and the goal of policymakers is to support those large-scale movements of power, you know, that is widely recognized as valuable. And even though there are 330 transmission owners in the country that have ways to recover costs on their local systems, we don't really have a way to recover costs on these interstate highway type lines. So again, that's what I think is in the minds of policymakers. And they're trying to address it. And this money, if they pass these bills, would certainly help a lot. There's additionally Power Marketing Administration Loan Authority. There's some money for DOE studies and helping with planning, and $100 million. Probably a lot of people on this call who would be a part of that. There are smart grid investment grants that would cover grid enhancing technologies, among other things. $800 million funding for states to be constructively engaged in planning and siting, as well as for economic development to kind of help ease the pain or reward and thank hosting communities for transmission. And then restoring federal backstop siting to its original intent is in the bills. There is discussion literally as we speak about potentially adding more for transmission, as negotiations go on through this week. So we will see about that. And last 30 seconds here as I wrap up, there are executive agencies that get involved. This administration under Secretary Granholm at DOE and Biden-Harris White House really want to deploy. They have a lot of permitting authority over federal lands, and they're going to try to work on speeding that up. They may get this federal backstop siting. Well, they have some, and then they might get more. They want to set up a grid deployment authority within the DOE, and they want to they obviously use whatever loan authority they get, additional loan authority as well as existing. And so I think we'll see a lot of action from the administration trying to help remove roadblocks and move transmission forward. So, Aaron, that's probably enough. I'll turn it back to you.
That was great, and thanks for providing all that new content and the review of the latest happenings in Washington. I know myself that I have failed to keep up with everything changing. So we've got one more talk. We've got questions that are really coming in. So Theodore Paradise, so glad to have you here today to tell us about Anbaric's recent studies and what they've been thinking about on the East Coast. So Theodore, please take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Rob. So thanks everybody for joining us today. It's a privilege to be with you, and I really appreciate everyone making the time. And just like a concert where you have to wait till the end of the set for your favorite song, Aaron mentioned that there'd be some new stuff today. So I'm going to share with this group a project that hasn't been seen anywhere else before in detail. So it's your reward for sticking with us on a Thursday afternoon. You'll see some stuff drawn out that is a first-time share out there in the public. So let's dive into it. What I'm going to talk about today is transmission for offshore wind. It follows a bit of what Rob and Hannes and others have talked about, but it does have its own nuances. And so I want to highlight some of those, what we're doing, how we should be thinking about transmission for offshore wind, which is going to be a huge part of the changing grid. So this is a little, you can think of it as a cartoon type graphic that I've used before. Maybe some of you have seen. Basically two ways to think about it, and we can talk a little bit more as I go through this about why you want to do it one way or the other, benefits to one way or the other. But there on the left is as Hannes and Rob talked about, sort of project by project interconnection, sort of the extension cords to each individual project. On the right, if you plan that out, you have something more like Texas CREZ. Here I have that illustrated. Instead of extension cords, I have power strips. And, it's a similar sort of thing. We've got a bunch of little cords up to the power strips, and then we have fewer cables going into the grid. So when we talk about offshore wind transmission, there's sort of this, sometimes it seems like we're talking about a whole different power system. But a lot of what has been discussed here today, still applies. The grid is the grid. And the understanding that large planned network energy systems are more efficient and can save significant money to end users and provide increased reliability, that's not new. Texas CREZ graphic on the left, Tehachapi there up in the right, the California process is an ESIG map of a macro grid there in the bottom. But, as we look at cost benefit analysis, even on production cost metric, which Hannes indicated is not the be all end all, but Anbaric asked ISO New England to do a production cost run of what adding even 8 gigawatts to the New England system would do. And just adding 8 gigawatts into the RTO reduced the production cost of electricity by half across the RTO, 50%. Production cost of electricity cut in half, 8 gigawatts. And then it can scale upwards. It runs into curtailments if it's all going into the same part of the grid, but that gets into why you want to plan out the transmission for offshore wind deliberately. And so what does this matter? You know, when we talk about, oh, reactive planning is bad and one by one planning creates issues, that's easy enough to say, but, you know, let's dig into the specifics a little bit. What are the limits on integrating offshore wind? And so there's limited substation space near the coasts and expansion for new substations, as you can imagine. If you're thinking around Boston, if you're thinking around Long Island or Manhattan, the coast of New Jersey, these can be very difficult places to find more acres and expand substations. What you want to do is, if you have a few breaker positions, you want to put the biggest circuits that you can into those and maximize the approach to the substation and maximize the existing footprint of the substation. Even the approaches, you think of the ocean as vast, and that's, you know, it's certainly true in some cases, but along the coast, there's a lot going on. And some of the places where we've looked, really, you can get one cable bundle through, maybe a couple, and that's it. So you need to, you know, if you can do 400 megawatts in a tri-core AC, or you could do 2,000 megawatts in an HVDC bundle, you know, go for the 2,000 over the 400. And again, that's going to be much more cost effective. And then, you know, existing terrestrial grid thermal overloads, voltage issues, depending on what the injection points are, you want to think about that and plan it out so you're not running into big upgrades on the onshore grid that you don't need to necessarily make right off. And so, you know, does the transmission approach make a difference, how we're thinking about it to dealing with some of these limits on integrating offshore wind? And so are some of the current planning rules helping us get there or hurting us? So what I wanted to just talk about are some examples from New England and New York that sort of make the case about why you want to do this, these integration issues I was just talking about. These were from a study that Brattle and GE did in New England a couple of years ago now, or a year and a half ago. The line-by-line approach is the little map on the left there. You see lots of lines. The red on the map you see are overloads, where you have to build new onshore circuits. The same amount of offshore wind generation is being added in the graphic to the right. And you'll see there aren't the onshore overloads on the existing system, so that's huge. That's over $1.5 billion right there of avoided onshore upgrades. But you also see just a massive reduction in the amount of cables. That's going to mean you know, easier permitting, less interactions with fisheries, and just, you know, less ecological impact. And so the planned approach can reduce cabling by 50% or more, and taking the generation into deliberately planned places on the grid close to loads, that reduces curtailment significantly. Some of these runs you see talking about integration of renewable, you know, they paint kind of a dim picture of, well, you know, we'll hit a certain number and then we have to just curtail it. And so why would we even bother? And the problem with those is they have all the generation going into one spot. In New England, for example, it often goes all into southeast Massachusetts. And yes, if you put all the generation into one part of the grid, you are going to overload things, you're going to curtail them. A lot of the times it looks like you can't really scale it. So you actually run into an existential issue for offshore wind if you're doing it that way. And so really the upshot here was, you know, by being deliberate about forward planning, like Rob was talking about, and not being reactive but proactive, like Hannes was talking about, you get twice as much wind into the system before you hit some of these big upgrade issues. Really, almost 12,000 megawatts instead of 5,500, 5,800 megawatts. So the difference is significant, and those cost to consumers can be cost savings can be significant. So we did that study. What's currently happening? Well, a lot of the first projects are bundled with radials. They're going closest to the leased areas into that same part of the system. And I think it's one of those unfortunate "I told you so" moments of what the study shows is maybe not surprisingly what's happened. So everything went into these radials went into the same part of the system. ISO New England had to launch a cluster study. You really can't get more power into that part of the system. And now we're looking at over $1 billion upgrades to get the power off the Cape. And then the southeast part of the system still has some overload issues. So you need to build another expensive cable up to load in the Boston area. So, with a few months go by and we really just see what the study predicts happening. New York, we had a similar study. Same sort of thing. You see the generator lead line approach on the left and the planned approach on the right. 59% fewer marine cable miles, 54% fewer cable landings. Again, super important for permitting. Even communities that are pro offshore wind don't want a bunch of cables going under their beaches. And so if you can reduce the shore crossing, that's a big deal. That actually de-risks offshore wind. Again, reduce curtailment and significantly less, 1.5 billion less in the onshore upgrades needed. And then what's happening in New York right now is we're right kind of one step behind New England. Some of those bundled projects, the generation and transmission, using the radial AC lines, and they're using up limited approaches like through the Narrows up to Gowanus around Brooklyn. We studied it, and it looks like about 4 cables can fit, and some of those paths are already being occupied by 400 megawatt AC circuits instead of much larger HVDC bundles. What does this mean? It means you get to having to figure out real estate, around Manhattan faster than you would have before. And I think everybody just has a general sense that that's very expensive and difficult to do. It's not a gloom and doom. It's one of those things where you need to shift what we're doing to a more planned approach right now. Every step that we take that doesn't optimize the existing grid is a bit of a missed opportunity. And I think we've seen some of that notion start to really coalesce and people recognizing this. Rob mentioned that the most activity he's ever seen has been happening right now at FERC. And this is true for transmission planning in general, but also for offshore wind. FERC did an offshore wind transmission technical conference just focused on the transmission last October. And former Chairman Wellinghoff noted that planning out, being proactive was just a clearly superior approach. James Cotter from Shell noted that it was really an existential sort of issue, again, needing to plan it out to make sure that we don't sort of pick all the low-hanging fruit and we just run into next steps that are just really hard because we haven't taken the forethought to optimize the existing grid. NARUC issued a resolution in favor of doing this kind of planned offshore wind transmission for offshore wind last November. And then in November, New Jersey said, that's right, let's do this. And they issued an RFP for a planned transmission system for offshore wind. And that's one of our projects there is what I want to talk about in a little bit. It's not just the US. We had Albert talk a little bit about Europe, and there's some transmission first happening there with tenants in Germany and 50 hertz in Belgium. But Ofgem and the UK, this UK, you think about that sort of like your best scenario for just doing radials. It's just coast. It's just unlimited coast. And that's how they started for their first 10 gigawatts or so. But the approach there now is moving towards a meshed planned transmission network. Here we have kind of the quote in the middle, that we do not consider the individual radial offshore transmission links for this amount of offshore generation are likely to be economical, sensible, or acceptable for consumers and local communities. National Grid, which has an affiliate that is a transmission-owning utility in the Northeast, in New England and New York. Their affiliate in the UK is actually the grid operator, had some study work on this that they shared earlier in the year by moving towards this planned sort of system, what kind of benefits to consumers are we talking about? 6 billion pounds saved, half the assets again. But this was really important, and it kind of goes to what I was just talking about with New York. That third little graphic over on the top there, benefits are reduced the longer you wait. And if you start in 2025, this is what these numbers are based on. But if you wait till 2030 to do this and keep doing radials and not really working on the planned transmission, being proactive, those benefits drop by half. So that's, I think, a significant lesson. So what needs to change? I have some slides here that will be available for folks to look at. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through every one of these. Rob mentioned some of these things, but really the upshot is where we are right now is that we have 40 gigawatts of offshore wind in the various targets along the East Coast, and the planning processes are not aligned. If you look at Rhode Island saying I want 100% renewables by 2030, Connecticut saying I want 100% renewable energy by 2040, same with New York. And then you look, say for example, in the ISO New England Regional System Plan, you would expect, okay, there must be a bunch of, transmission. Transmission can take 8, 9, 10 years to do. It's almost 2022. So there must be a lot of planned transmission since all these things are in statutes. It's not like you have to wonder what the goals are or where the states want to go. You know what they want to go. You know how much they want. And yet today, if you look in that New England RTEP, you won't find any transmission for these state policy goals in there at all, because it's just not how the planning rules work. Everything's being done right now through one-by-one generator interconnection planning expansion. So I have some slides here about ways to do interconnection reform and the policy fixes, the regional planning, and what suggestions are for the regional planning fix. But I'm going to skip to something that is a path that I mentioned, New Jersey. So what New Jersey is doing is it's their RFP. They're saying we want to do a transmission system for offshore wind. And PJM had actually filed something along these lines when they did their Order 1000 compliance. It was sort of outside of Order 1000, but they added it on, and FERC said that's fine. But what's exciting was there was a policy statement that came out in June from FERC, and it didn't get a lot of play, but it's actually significant. The policy statement said, if you are a state and you want to work with your RTO and have them help you with an RFP, you can do that. That's something that you can get together, work on, submit a study agreement to FERC for review and approval, and move forward with something like New Jersey is doing. And so this is a potential path forward that, Rob mentioned the ANOPR. That's great. We all put in comments, 170 sets of comments. We expect an actual NOPR or a rule in the first part of 2022. As Chairman Glick has said, it may be a rule by the end of 2022, and then compliance filings will take some time. So a voluntary approach is exciting because states and RTOs could start to work together today if states are so inclined to do that. And I mentioned New Jersey is doing that for their 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind. This was a little bit of an idea sketch that they had released when they said we're going to go forward with this. So I've talked a lot about planning transmission instead of doing the radials. And so I wanted to share quickly and leave some time for discussion, what that actually looks like in the real world. Okay, so here it is. This is, for those of you who have stuck with it today, you're the first to see this. We put in 19 different scenarios into the New Jersey RFP. This is called Boardwalk Power Link. And you'll see here on the right, you'll see the various BOEM lease areas. And then what you see are platforms and a networked transmission system, HVDC, that is collecting and bringing this power to shore. So this is, it's more than just hypothetical. This is a real world, one of the 19 submissions we put into PJM. And I think, we wanted to share this today with you because it gives some concrete shape and substance to what planned transmission looked like. I wanted to do something else too with this to really sort of hit home sort of Hannes's points. You know, well, why do you do this? Why do you plan it out? Why do you be proactive? Because here's the alternative of what we're doing today. So that's the red line. This is the radials. So, you know, it's like, oh, Theodore, did you just throw a bunch of radials, you know, a bunch of red lines on a map? Like, do these match up to anything? So I thought I'd show my work on the right. So I have the AC versions up on top, you know, Atlantic shores and ocean wind, you know, the areas that the amount of capacity they have. And then you think about 400 megawatts per AC cable on a tri-core is state of the art. So that's these red lines. And then the project above that, the DC cables, this sort of explains, you know, 31111 versus 3344. So it's 19 to 20 cables versus 9 cables. Again, you're seeing about a 50% reduction from this back up to this. And what's exciting about this is this is networked, right? HVDC, grid operators. This is just, I mentioned at the start, the grid is the grid. We talked about, you know, if you move power around the grid, you can solve for reliability issues. This starts to just be an expansion of the grid. You can close in breakers, you can move power from here to here or here over through here. You have options because what you're doing is you're not just interconnecting offshore wind, you're actually expanding the transmission grid when you start to do this through planning. And so now you're not just cutting the number of cables and all of that, you're actually expanding out the grid, and that's important for reliability as we start to see some of the fossil fleet retire as well in greater numbers. And so I'll just close with, I think we can do what New Jersey's doing, other places, move the voluntary agreement approaches forward. PJM had a bit of a cookbook, but I think FERC saw that and said it might not be clear to everybody else that they can do something like this. They issued that policy order in June. If you're not familiar with it, the docket's in my slides, so I encourage you to take a look at it. And that gives us a way to move forward where we don't have to wait another year or year and a half or 2 years for new planning rules. And that's why I'm so excited about that particular approach and wanted to highlight it. So thanks for your attention today on this. And I will turn it back to Aaron and we'll hopefully have some time here for some Q&A and discussion.
Theodore, that was great. Thank you so much for bringing all that new information to bear and showing us a lot of the different trade-offs and walking us through the maps. We've got about 20 questions that have come in on Slido. If I can get all the other panelists to turn their cameras on and come on back to the conversation, we will go ahead and start digging through these. Awesome. Thanks everybody for turning it back on. I'd say one of the most common terms we heard today was adjusted production costs, the way that benefits are calculated in most of the regions. And that's one of our top ranked questions today. So in folks' opinion, people on the panel, what is keeping regulators from taking benefits other than adjusted production costs into account?
If I could start with that, I think it's mostly the industry not presenting anything else to regulators. You know, folks are used to running a reliability model and getting the answers. So, you know, these ProMods and GridView and GMAPS models are the closest on the economic side to reliability planning model. You run the model, get a metric, and that's adjusted production cost. And regulators don't have a strong opinion. Now, if you run production cost first and then afterwards come in with other benefit, it looks like you're piling on. But in our experience, if these benefits are explained well, regulators are very receptive to recognizing and considering more than just adjusted production cost savings.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Cost allocation is so hard that I think a lot of stakeholders in each of these RTOs just don't want to pay for something that benefits somebody else. And it's a classic public good problem. It's universal. I'm sure it's the same issue in all continents and all transmission systems. And in this country, our planners, our RTOs are voluntary organizations. So, you know, if you have an RTO that says, all right, tough, everybody, you're just going to have to eat this cost. Well, guess what happens? A couple utilities tell the RTO they're leaving the RTO. So then that doesn't happen the next time. So that's a problem we've got in the U.S. We've got to overcome it, and I think FERC standards can overcome it. They can, they've got the authority to make it happen.
Yeah, I think what Rob is referring to is some parties will have an incentive to not count benefits and minimize benefits that are quantified, because if more would be quantified, they might get a larger share of project costs allocated. So there's sort of a race to the bottom, but by the time you're done with that, none of these projects meet the benefit cost thresholds.
Yeah, I think, Hannes, you're right. I think it's one of those things. It's an education point. It's not that regulators don't care about the other benefits. It's you want to highlight for regulators what some of the other benefits could be. And in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, that can be things like fuel security. Look, transmission helps you not be so locally dependent on a few generators that are hung off a gas pipeline that may have a constraint on a really cold day. So you can move power around and maybe you don't see the price spike, which can be huge. I mean, Rob, I think, or Hannes, you mentioned Texas, and that line could have paid for itself in a couple of days. I know when we've had a couple of weeks, like 14 or 15 days of cold snap in New England, you'll see $2 billion of cost added to the electricity market just from that peak cost of gas over a few weeks. And so the economic case for the transmission is certainly strong, but it can do other things like collapse load zone differences, price separation in capacity markets or energy markets too. So I think it's one of those things of, I've seen regulators be really receptive if you want to walk through the benefits of a given transmission project.
That was great. Let's go ahead and jump to the next question. This one talks a little bit about energy storage and how that might interplay with transmission upgrade deferrals. Any thoughts on that and how that applies to interregional transmission?
Yes. Maybe I can provide an example from Germany. German transmission system operators built battery storages, in total 450 megawatt in the first phase. They call it grid booster actually, but these are battery storages. So in the north and south of Germany, and they're used for redispatch purpose, so for congestion management purpose, especially for fast reaction. So after an outage takes place. So they are part of the network development planning.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a great hedge on overbuilding the transmission, or a great way to manage how much transmission you need to add. What other comments do we have from other folks about how storage and transmission might interact with one another?
Yeah, I think we have to be a little bit careful. There are many studies out there that sort of make some very global assumptions on these kinds of values. When we've actually looked into specific system, the benefits of batteries is highly location specific when it comes to TND, I mean distribution and transmission deferrals. We've done that in Nevada, for example. They have an 8,000 megawatt system, and locations with TND cost savings for achievable by batteries were maybe for about 400 megawatts of that 8,000 megawatt system. So that's about 5% of the installed load. So these savings can be significant. Batteries can be extremely valuable in making the transmission system work better, but not every battery you place on the system will provide that kind of value.
I would just also add, just really quick from a battery or storage perspective, you have a limited time frame on them, and so you're not necessarily getting the same reliability benefit as you are having redundant transmission paths into an area. And that's one of the concerns that we have had in batteries being the only solution. So in a lot of ways, I think they're actually complementary. If you pick the right location for the battery, it's highly effective, but then you also need the redundancy that the additional transmission brings along with it.
Yeah, I was just going to say what Rick said from the modeling perspective. What I see in some of these models that co-optimize the whole system with both storage and transmission is they end up, when you get to high renewable penetration, they end up being more complementary than substitutes.
I agree.
The CLAC, Vibrant Clean Energy, and other similar modeling efforts seem to show that.
Yeah, I agree with that, Rob. You see, like storage can be a huge tool to make sure that you're not just spilling renewables, that you're avoiding curtailments, you're charging batteries. But it can also avoid some upgrades, some expensive upgrade scenarios for the interconnection of renewables. And I think this is one of the things on the interconnection rules, the way the studies are done. Right now, a transmission project for renewables and paired with a battery, it's incremental. So you might have 800 megawatts of wind and a 400 megawatt battery. That's studied as 1,200 megawatts. Whereas, you may operate that system to actually have it as a battery that reduces some of those contingency and overload issues. So some flexibility around how the interconnection studies are done could help improve how storage can reduce some of these interconnection costs as well. The rules just don't allow it today because everything's just stacked one on top of the other. But I think that's one of the things that we're getting some visibility on, and as we talk about different rules going forward.
I want to go back to something that Rob said during his talk that I thought was really kind of provocative. You talked about some potential requirements to have like minimum interregional transfer capability between regions. I was like, whoa, what does he talk about there? Can you go back and like rewind and tell us more about that and explain what you were thinking?
Sure. So there's been some rumblings at FERC. There were some questions after, Winter Storm Uri and what's FERC going to do, because they do have some reliability authority over ERCOT, even if ERCOT's generally not FERC jurisdictional. And if you look at other places, again, these situations like Theodore just described, that interregional capacity sure comes in handy to keep the lights on. So, you can approach it with, joint planning or other things, but, maybe just to be safe and improve reliability, there should be this minimum standard. So I think I did see it in, I think the PJM comments, which is certainly, they're going to be very influential. And you got two commissioners, one and another one coming from the PJM region. And I think LS Power and maybe some others. Hannes, you've probably thought about it as well.
Yeah, no, it's a hard one. I mean, the first question is who would come up with what the minimum interconnection standard is. I think one could do it similar to what Albert explained is done in Europe, where you do a study that says this is good for the country, this is good for the region, so we should at least have that much capability between the regions to reduce costs. Whether FERC can make that a requirement or whether there's some sort of NERC reliability standard that could create a requirement, I don't think anybody has thought through that yet.
So I got some questions in here about how we deal with lines that are near end of life and the replacement costs of incorporating new planning lines. I think this really gets down to how do we upgrade existing corridors for old lines and use existing infrastructure or right-of-ways better? Any comments on that?
Well, I think the way New York does it is actually a good example for the rest of the country. When they look at transmission to address public policy needs, integrate renewables and so on, they're looking for solutions. They're getting proposal. They're identifying the needs similar in Europe. Then they're getting specific proposals, and some of these proposals find that the lowest cost way to create the transfer capability is to reconduct part of the existing lines, for example, or rebuild the existing lines at a higher voltage level. Now, if these lines are already 40, 50 years old and would have to be replaced in another decade anyway, you can actually say, by doing this now, I save having to replace this line 10 years from now. And while we don't know exactly what the end of these lines are, we know that they won't live indefinitely. And today, I think we are spending about $10 billion a year on just in-kind replacements that are planned by the local utilities without having that regional picture.
This is awesome. I've got one more question before we let everybody go. This one is about distributed generation and PV and storage versus the idea of building big transmission. If we're getting half of our generation from behind the meter or distributed assets, what does that mean for the requirements of storage in the United States, in Europe, and other places?
Well, I think the many studies that show us that storage and transmission is really complementary. You can reduce the cost of overbuilding transmission by putting a certain amount of storage in. But, you know, if the entire northeastern US is in a snowstorm for a week, you just can't build that much storage. And whether you have distributed solar or utility scale solar at that point doesn't matter. You need the interregional connectivity. I think there's a lot of distributed solar in southern Germany, and you still need to build huge transfer capability between the southern German solar-rich region and the northern German wind-rich region, because that's how you keep the lights on when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. And I think storage is helping with that, but you still need more transmission to have the geographic diversity that reduces costs.
Yeah. And Aaron, you're in the moderator chair here, but this is a great question for you in a way, right? It's if you have all this distributed gen and PV, you know, I think some of the work you've done and some of the macro grid looks that we've done show, you know, the wind isn't always blowing in a certain place, but it's blowing someplace, right? You connect these grids up, the sun isn't always shining someplace. And we see how significant transmission maximizes PV and wind across the country, really solves a lot of these issues. So I look at it and say, as we move to this distributed gen, this PV, this wind, the case for transmission is bigger. It's stronger than it's ever been before, because especially at those higher voltages that aren't really location specific, that stuff just moves around seamlessly in a lot of ways and replaces the 1950s, 60s, 70s model of locational generation right next to load.
Theodore, that was such a great way to wrap up the session and bring together a lot of the messages. Transmission makes all the markets and all the resources work better together, and all the resources participating, I think, prevents us from having to put some pressure on making sure that we don't gold plate the system or put a copper sheet out there. So awesome conversation, folks. So glad to continue the conversation with you virtually online. You'll see our videos shared on YouTube. Please share it with others that didn't get a chance to see this great content, and always feel free to reach out if you want to volunteer to be in a future session or have ideas on how we can do better. Thank you, everyone, for participating wherever you were in the world today, whether it's early morning or late in the evening. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.